Dr. Amara Osei was the kind of woman who made entire hospital corridors go quiet when she walked through them, and not because of anything dramatic. She did, but because of the way she carried herself, like the air around her had been pressed smooth and starched clean, just like her white coat, which was always perfectly buttoned and perfectly pressed and perfectly spotless. No matter what time of day it was, whether she was coming in at 7 in the morning with a coffee cup in one hand and a patient chart in the other, or leaving at 9 at night after a double shift that would have crumbled a lesser person into dust, she was 34 years old. And she had been working at Northfield Memorial Hospital for 6 years, and in those 6 years she had built a reputation that other doctors twice her age would have killed, for she was known as the steady one, the unshakable one, the woman you wanted in the room when everything was falling apart, because Amara Osei did not fall apart. She was the kind of doctor who could be elbow deep in a crisis, and her voice would still come out like warm tea poured slowly into a cup, calm and measured and absolutely certain. Nurses loved her not just because she was good at what she did, but because she remembered their names and their birthdays and the names of their children, and she never once spoke to anyone the way some of the other doctors did, like they were furniture put there for convenience. She treated every person in that hospital like they mattered, and they did to her. They genuinely did. The other doctors admired her from a respectful distance, because there was something about Amara that made you want to be better at your job just by being near her, and also something that made you feel like you could never quite reach her, not because she was cold, but because she seemed to already be somewhere you were still trying to get to. And the patients adored her completely and without reservation, because when Amara sat beside a hospital bed and took your hand and looked you in the eyes, you felt for the first time in maybe your whole life that someone was truly paying attention to you, and only you, and that nothing else in the whole enormous spinning world mattered more to her in that moment than you outside of work. Amara had a life that was orderly and deliberate. She had a beautiful apartment on the 4th floor of a building with big windows and good light, and she kept it the way she kept herself, clean and thoughtful and quietly elegant. She cooked real food on Sunday evenings, and she read actual books with actual pages, and she went running 3 mornings a week along the river path, and she had a small circle of friends she trusted deeply, and she was happy. She was genuinely happy, or at least she had convinced herself thoroughly enough that it felt like the same thing nobody at work knew. She was gay not because she hid it exactly, but because the subject had simply never come up. She was private about her personal life in the same way she was private about everything that was not directly related to medicine. She kept a clean line between her professional self and her private self, and she kept it very firmly, and she had kept it so well for so long that it had stopped feeling like effort. It just felt like the natural shape of things. And then Zoe Marquetti walked into the hospital, and everything that Amara had arranged so carefully began to tilt. Zoe was a photographer, and she had been commissioned by a healthcare magazine to spend 3 weeks at Northfield Memorial, documenting the daily life of hospital workers for a feature called The Human Side of Medicine, which was the kind of title that made Amara raise one perfectly shaped eyebrow when the hospital administrator explained it to her in the briefing meeting. Amara had been asked to be one of the primary subjects, which she'd agreed to because she was the kind of person who said yes to things that were useful for the hospital, even when she personally would have preferred to say, "Absolutely not, thank you very much." Zoe arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, and she was not at all what Amara had expected. She was 31 years old with dark curly hair that was doing several things at once, none of which were what anyone would call professional, and she had paint on her jacket, which Amara noticed immediately, and also warm brown eyes that caught the light in a way that made the fluorescent lighting of the hospital corridor seem briefly like something natural and soft. She was carrying 3 camera bags and a coffee, and she was trying to sign in at the reception desk while doing all of this. And she was losing. Amara had been standing nearby, reviewing a chart, and she watched this struggle for approximately 4 seconds before she set the chart down, walked over, took one of the camera bags from Zoe's shoulder, and held it while Zoe finished signing in. Zoe looked at her with surprise, and then with a smile so wide and genuine it was almost startling. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was slightly breathless from the struggle and also from something else, maybe just from being Zoe, which Amara would come to understand was always a slightly breathless kind of existence. She said, "I was about to drop everything, and that would have been a very undignified start to 3 weeks." Amara handed the bag back and said, "You must be the photographer." And Zoe said, "I must be, yes, and the name is Zoe, and you are." And Amara said, Say and Zoe said Dr. Osei, and the way she said it like she was tasting the name and finding it interesting made something shift very slightly in Amara's chest, which she noted and filed away under things to examine later when she had time. She did not have time for the next 8 days. What Amara had not accounted for was how much it would affect her to be photographed. She was used to being observed. She was a doctor. And patients watched her constantly looking for reassurance, looking for information, reading her face for signals, but being observed by Zoe was different in a way she could not immediately explain. Zoe was quiet when she worked. She had an extraordinary ability to become almost invisible. She would position herself in a corner of the room or in a doorway, and she would go still in a way that made you genuinely forget she was there until the soft click of her camera reminded you, and then you would look up and catch her eye, and she would give you this small private smile that said, "I see you," and it felt like a gift rather than an intrusion. She was shooting film and digital both, and she said she preferred film because it made her think harder about each frame, and Amara, who made every decision deliberately and with full commitment, found this deeply satisfying in a way she did not examine too closely. By the end of the first week, Amara had observed the following things about Zoe Marquetti. She took her coffee with oat milk and no sugar. She could not pass a child in the corridor without making them smile, somehow through a face or a gesture, or just by producing a small toy rabbit from her jacket pocket, which she apparently always carried. She had a habit when she was concentrating hard of pressing her tongue briefly to her upper lip. She laughed with her whole body, not just her face. She asked questions that were not the questions you expected she would ask. Instead of asking Amara about medicine, she asked her what it felt like to walk into the hospital in the morning, and whether it ever felt different to walk out of it at night, and Amara had answered honestly, which surprised her. She was gay. Amara knew this not from anything Zoe said, but from the way she moved through the world, which was a certain kind of ease that Amara recognized because it was the ease of someone who had stopped performing for an audience that was watching to see if you would be what they expected. She was looking at Amara not constantly, not intrusively, but in the way that meant something, and Amara knew what it meant because she recognized it, and because it sent a warmth through her that she had not felt in a long time, in which she handled by being extremely professional. On the 9th day, Zoe caught her. This was how Amara thought of it later, that Zoe had caught her in an unguarded moment, because in the afternoon there had been a difficult case, a young woman only 22 who had come in alone and frightened, and Amara had spent an hour with her, just the two of them sitting in the room, not the room where Amara was the doctor exactly, but the room where she was also just a person who understood what it meant to be scared and to need someone to sit with you. Zoe was not in the room. She had more sense and more kindness than to intrude, but when Amara came out into the corridor afterwards, she was there, and she was not holding her camera. She had put it down somewhere, and she was just standing. And when Amara came through the door, Zoe looked at her very steadily and said, "Are you okay?" And Amara, who was always okay, or always at least presented as okay, felt something catch in her throat, and she said yes, and Zoe said okay, and they stood in the corridor for a moment, and then Amara said, "She's going to be fine," and Zoe said, "I know," and then Amara said, "I just hate this part," and Zoe said, "What part?" and Amara said, "The part where you know they came in alone." Neither of them said anything else, and then Amara straightened and became Dr. Osei again with such visible efficiency that Zoe almost smiled, except her eyes were too soft for smiling. Later that evening, Zoe knocked on the door of the small office Amara used for paperwork and said, "I'm going to get dinner from the Thai place on Clement Street. Can I bring you something?" And Amara, who should have said, "No thank you," said, "Yes, please pad see ew with tofu," and Zoe said noted and left and came back 40 minutes later with exactly that plus spring rolls she had added, because she said, "You look like you could use spring rolls too." They ate together in the office with the door open and the sounds of the hospital moving around them, and they talked for the first time not about medicine and not about photography, but about other things, about where they had grown up. Amara in London originally before moving to the States at 24, Zoe in a small town in Oregon before escaping to San Francisco at 18, and about what they missed and what they did not miss, and about the strangeness of becoming the person you are and not always knowing when it happened. It was the most Amara had talked about herself to a relative stranger in years, and when Zoe left at 10 that night, Amara sat in the quiet office and thought with her characteristic honesty, this is becoming a problem. She was right. By the end of the second week, the staff at Northfield Memorial had begun to notice things. Nurse Delilah Park, who was 61 years old and had been watching people fall in love in hospital corridors for 35 years, noticed first. She said nothing because she was wise, but she started smiling. A particular smile every time Amara and Zoe were in the same room, which was a smile that anyone paying attention would have read correctly. Dr. Marcus Webb, who was Amara's colleague and closest friend at the hospital, and who had known she was gay for 3 years and had never mentioned it to anyone, noticed second, and he was less subtle about it. He knocked on her office door one afternoon and said, "You know, the photographer really likes you." And Amara looked up from her chart and said she likes her job, and Marcus said, "Right, okay, sure," and left. The residents noticed because residents notice everything. They're like very sleep-deprived scientists of human behavior, and they started having small quiet bets in the break room, which Amara would have been appalled to know about. Zoe noticed that everyone was noticing, and this made her smile in a way. She tried to hide behind her camera. What nobody noticed except Amara herself was the precise moment she understood she was in trouble. And that was on a Wednesday afternoon when Zoe was photographing a training exercise in the simulation lab, and Amara was meant to be reviewing charts at the workstation in the corner. But she had stopped reviewing charts approximately 12 minutes ago and was instead watching Zoe work, watching the way she moved around the room, quiet and certain, finding angles that were not the obvious angles, but the ones that would tell the real story, and the way she handled her camera with the same tenderness she used for everything, like things deserved to be treated carefully. And Amara was watching all of this and feeling something enormous and warm moving through her chest, like weather changing, and she thought, "I'm in significant trouble." She looked back at her charts. She reviewed them very thoroughly for the next hour. On the 15th day of Zoe's 3-week assignment, they had their first real conversation about who they were outside of this building, and it happened because of rain. It was 6 in the evening, and Zoe had finished her last session of the day and was packing her equipment in the lobby, and Amara had just finished a consultation and was heading out. And the rain had started while they were both inside and was now performing what could only be described as a catastrophic amount of weather outside the glass doors. They stood side by side looking at it. Amara said, "I have an umbrella, but I left it in my car, which is on the 2nd level of the parking structure." Zoe said, "I have a rain jacket, but it is in my studio, which is 40 minutes away." They looked at the rain. Zoe said, "There is a bar across the street." Amara considered this for approximately 2 seconds, which was longer than it needed to take, and then she said, "Yes, all right." They ran across the street, which Amara did with the contained dignity of someone who did not run places, and which Zoe did with no dignity whatsoever, and a laugh that was audible even above the rain. And they arrived in the bar damp and slightly breathless, and Amara was laughing too, which surprised her. Bar was small and warm and played music at a volume that was just right for conversation, and they found a table in the back and ordered drinks and took off their wet outer layers and settled in. And something about being outside the hospital somewhere that had nothing to do with medicine made the air between them change into something that was more honest and also considerably more dangerous. They talked for 3 hours. Amara learned that Zoe had been a photojournalist for 4 years before pivoting to documentary work and feature photography, because she said, "I wanted to make things that were about something rather than just responding to things that were happening." She said, "I wanted to choose the story, not just report it." She learned that Zoe had a younger sister in Portland who was her favorite person in the world, and an older brother who drove her crazy but who she loved fiercely, and parents who had taken about 3 years to fully understand and accept who she was, but who had gotten there, and who she said were the best people she knew for having done the work. She learned that Zoe had been in a long relationship for 4 years that had ended 18 months ago, and that she was still learning what it meant to be herself without that structure around her, and that she was mostly okay with this, but sometimes at 3 in the morning, not entirely. She learned that Zoe had opinions about almost everything: literature, cities, coffee, architecture, music, and that these opinions were thoughtful and sometimes surprising, and that having them challenged made her more interested, not defensive. And Zoe learned things about Amara that Amara did not usually give away. She learned that Amara had wanted to be a writer before she wanted to be a doctor, and that she still wrote sometimes just for herself in notebooks she kept in a drawer and never showed anyone. She learned that Amara was profoundly close to her mother, who still lived in London, and that they talked every Sunday morning, and that missing her was one of the consistent quiet aches of Amara's life. She learned that Amara had been in 2 serious relationships, both with women, and that the last one had ended 2 years ago, and that what she had taken from it was not bitterness, but a kind of careful clarity about what she wanted and what she would not settle for. She learned that Amara danced. This came out when a song came on in the bar, and Amara went briefly still in a way that was not quite professional stillness, but something more alive than that. And Zoe said, "You know this song?" And Amara said, "I know this song extremely well." And Zoe said, "Are you a dancer?" And there was a pause in which Amara decided to tell the truth, and she said, "I dance. I've danced since I was 8 years old, and it is the one thing I do that is completely for myself." Zoe looked at her steadily for a moment, and then she said, somehow without any performance or agenda in her voice, "I would love to see that someday." And Amara, who never blushed, or at least had not in a long time, felt warmth rise to her face. And she said maybe someday. They looked at each other, and the thing between them that had been building for 2 weeks sat in the space of the table and was acknowledged without being named, and that was enough, for now it was more than enough. Rain had stopped by the time they stepped back outside, and the street was reflecting the lights back up at them, doubled and golden, and they walked toward the parking structure together, and at the entrance, Zoe stopped and said, "Thank you for tonight." And Amara said, "Thank you." And Zoe said, "I mean it, this was my favorite night in a long time." And Amara said, "Mine too." And then she added which was the most she would give right now, but it was true. She drove home and sat in her car in her parking spot for 5 minutes before going inside, and she was smiling, and she did not try to stop herself. On the 18th day, Zoe showed her the photograph. She brought her laptop to the small office at the end of the day when the hospital had gone into its quieter evening rhythm, and she sat beside Amara at the desk, which was close enough that their arms were almost touching, and she opened the folder and said, "Tell me what you think. Honestly, I can take it." Amara looked. Photographs were extraordinary, and she could see that immediately, not as someone who knew photography, but as someone who knew what it felt like to be seen truly, and what it looked like when seeing was done with love and without agenda. There were photographs of the whole hospital. The nurses laughing in the break room, the residents falling asleep in chairs, the orderlies moving through corridors with the particular grace of people who knew exactly where they were going. There were photographs of hands, of procedures viewed from angles that turned them into something abstract and almost beautiful. There were photographs of waiting rooms that managed somehow to make the act of waiting look like something profound, and there were photographs of Amara. Zoe had photographed her through 2.5 weeks, and there were dozens of frames, and in all of them Amara looked like herself, which sounds obvious, but was actually extraordinary, because what it meant was that Zoe had photographed not the performance of Dr. Osei, which was the thing most people saw, but the person inside that performance. And those two things were not entirely separate, but they were not entirely the same either. There was one photograph taken through the glass wall of a consultation room from outside, looking in, of Amara sitting beside a patient, and the patient was an elderly man, and Amara had her hand over his, and she was leaning slightly forward, and the light was falling in a particular way, and the photograph looked like something painted, except it was real and it was true, and something about it made Amara's breath catch. She said, "This is extraordinary." And Zoe said quietly, "Thank you." And there was a pause, and then Zoe said, "You know what I find most interesting about photographing you?" And Amara said, "Tell me." And Zoe said, "Everyone in this hospital sees this version of you, the calm, controlled, brilliant doctor, and I can see why they see it, because it is real. It is absolutely real. But when you think no one is watching, there is this other thing." Amara looked at her. Zoe said, "It is not different exactly. It is more like there is more. It is like the calm is the container, but what is inside the container is this other thing, this more intense version, and I keep trying to photograph that thing, and I can almost get it, but not quite." And she paused and said, "I think I would need to see you outside this place to get it properly." The silence after this was the kind that meant more than words did. Amara said quietly, "After the assignment is finished." And Zoe said yes, and Amara said yes. That was all they said. But it was everything. The last day of Zoe's assignment was a Friday, and the hospital administrator threw a small gathering in the afternoon to thank her, and people brought food, and there was the kind of atmosphere that a free Friday afternoon gathering in a hospital always has, which is the atmosphere of people who work very hard and are extremely grateful for an excuse to stop for an hour. Zoe moved through the room with the ease she had everywhere, and accepted thank yous and gave small prints of photographs she had made for various staff members, which made people genuinely emotional in the way that a good photograph of yourself or someone you love always does, because it shows you something true that you had not quite seen before. Marcus found Amara standing by the window holding a glass of sparkling water and watching the room, and he stood beside her, and he said, "So?" And Amara said, "Do not." And he said, "I was just going to say the photographs are good." And Amara said, "They are extraordinary." And he said, "Yes, they are, and also she's very nice, and also you've been noticeably happier for 2 weeks. And I'm just saying." And Amara said, Marcus, and he said, I'm going to get more food, goodbye. Across the room, Zoe found Amara with her eyes in the way she'd been doing for 3 weeks, and she smiled, and Amara smiled back, and it was the kind of exchange that would have looked like nothing to anyone not paying attention, and like everything to anyone who was when the gathering went down and people drifted back to their work. Amara walked Zoe to the lobby, and Zoe had all 3 camera bags again, and this time she handled them without difficulty because she was not also trying to sign in at a desk at the door. She turned and said, you have my number from the assignment coordination, and Amara said, I do, and Zoe said, use it, and Amara said, I will, and Zoe said, tonight if you want, and Amara laughed, which was genuine and unguarded, and Zoe looked at her like she had been given a gift, and then she said, good night, Dr. Osei, and walked out into the afternoon. Amara stood in the lobby for a moment and then went back to her patients because there were still 4 hours left in her shift, and she was excellent at her job, but she texted Zoe at 8:47 when she was between patients, and she said, are you free Sunday? And Zoe responded in approximately 4 seconds with yes. Absolutely, completely free. What do you have in mind? And Amara thought for a moment, and then she typed something she would not ordinarily have typed, which was, there is a dance class I go to on Sunday mornings. That is not what you think it is. I mean, it is dancing, but it is also something else. And then she stopped and deleted that and just wrote dance class Sunday morning, and Zoe sent back, I told you I wanted to see that, and Amara sent back 9 a.m. and her address and put her phone in her pocket and went back to work. She spent more time than she would admit deciding what to wear on Sunday morning. This was unusual for Amara, who dressed with efficiency and taste, but without particular anxiety. She knew what she liked and she wore it, and that was that. But on Sunday, she stood in her closet for 4 minutes longer than she needed to, and then put on the clothes she had known she was going to put on all along, which were her dance clothes, a soft pair of fitted trousers and a wrap top in deep burgundy that she knew was good on her, and her worn canvas shoes. And she pulled her hair back and looked at herself in the mirror and thought, you were being ridiculous, and then thought, yes, but here we are. Zoe arrived at 5 minutes to 9 in the rain jacket from the storm night, plus jeans and boots and a bright orange sweater that should have been too much, but on Zoe was exactly right, and she was holding 2 coffees which she presented and said, oat milk, no sugar, right? And Amara said correct and took the cup and said, you remembered, and Zoe said, I pay attention. The dance class was in a studio above a bookshop about 12 minutes walk from Amara's building, and it was run by a woman named Rosa, who was in her 50s and had the posture of someone who had been dancing since before she could properly walk, and who ran a class on Sunday mornings that was not beginner and not professional, but something in between, which was to say it was for people who danced because they needed to, not because they were building a career. Amara had been coming for 4 years. Zoe watched from the side of the room because Rosa allowed 1 observer when someone brought a guest, and she sat in a folding chair with her coffee and she watched, and here's what she saw. She saw Amara Osei, who was precise and measured and controlled in every other contact. She'd observed her and become something else entirely, not wild exactly, that was not the right word, but free in the way that freedom feels when it comes from inside a person rather than from an absence of constraint. It was the freedom of someone who had found the thing they were best at in the deepest sense, not most skilled at, but most themselves in, and who was doing it without anyone watching, or at least believing that the music in Rose's class was not any one thing. It moved from something classical to something that had African rhythms in it to something that was contemporary and almost ambient. And through all of it, Amara moved with a fluency that had nothing of the careful, measured, professional in it, only this other thing, this more intense version Zoe had glimpsed in photographs and been trying to capture. She was not trying to be seen, she was just dancing, and Zoe did not take a single photograph, she just watched, and she felt something happen in her chest that she recognized as the particular tenderness of seeing someone at their most true, and she thought, I am done. I'm completely done for this woman. Afterwards, they walked back through the Sunday morning streets, and the city was quiet and golden with the specific light that late October mornings have when the sky is clear after rain. And they had finished their coffees but were still holding the cups because neither of them was quite ready to redirect their hands elsewhere. Amara said, you did not take any photographs, and Zoe said, no, and Amara said, why not? And Zoe was quiet for a moment, and then she said, some things are not for photographs. Amara looked at her. Zoe said, that was beautiful, Amara, and Amara felt her name in Zoe's mouth for the first time because for 3 weeks she had been D'Arce, and she felt it land somewhere warm and central, and she said, thank you. They stopped at a corner, and Zoe turned to her and said, can I take you to breakfast? And Amara said yes, and Zoe said, I know a place, and it turned out the place was a small Eritrean restaurant that was only open Sunday mornings and that served coffee in the traditional ceremony style with the small cups and the incense. And Amara sat across from Zoe in this warm small place and thought this person knew to bring me here over. Breakfast that lasted 2 hours, they moved into the territory of what they were to each other, which they did not do through declarations or interrogations, but through the accumulated weight of everything they shared, which by now was considerable, and the ease they had with each other, which was the ease of people who had both recognized something real and were choosing not to pretend they had not. Zoe said at one point, "I was not expecting you to be this," and Amara said, "What?" And Zoe said, "You at the hospital, you are like this extraordinarily composed person, which you are, but you are also this." And she gestured with her coffee cup at Amara in general, meaning all of this: the dancing, the books, the Sunday morning self, the person who laughed at the rain. And Amara said, "Which do you prefer?" And Zoe said without hesitation, "Both, I want all of it." They left the restaurant at 11:30 and they walked for another hour through the neighborhood, and Amara pointed out things she knew about buildings and streets because she was someone who had learned the city she lived in properly, and Zoe listened and asked questions and occasionally took photographs of things, not of Amara, of doorways and signs and one particularly old tree, and at some point their hands were close enough that the backs of their fingers were brushing as they walked, and neither of them moved away. And Amara thought I could simply take her hand. She took her hand, Zoe went still for half a step, and then she wrapped her fingers around Amara's properly, and they kept walking, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing needed to be said. The first time Amara went to Zoe's studio was 2 weeks after the Sunday morning, and by then they had seen each other 4 more times and had talked on the phone twice for longer than either of them had planned, and had texted in the way that you do when you are with someone in your mind, even when you are not with them in body, which is to say constantly and about everything. Zoe's studio was in a building in the Mission that housed 6 other artists, and it was large and chaotic in a way that Amara's apartment was not, and it smelled like developer fluid and coffee and something floral, and the walls were covered in photographs in various stages and sizes, and there were contact sheets and prints hanging from lines strung across the ceiling, and there were books everywhere and cameras in various states of assembly on a long work table, and there was a couch that had clearly spent considerable time being slept on, and a small kitchen alcove that had approximately 1 working burner. Amara stood in the middle of it and looked around and felt something loosen in her that she had not known was tight. She said, "This is wonderful." And she meant it completely. Zoe was watching her take it in, and she said, "Most people find it overwhelming." And Amara said, "I find it exactly right." And Zoe smiled and said, "Of course you do." And there was an intimacy in that, "Of course you do," that Amara felt in her whole chest. Zoe showed her everything: the darkroom in the back, where she developed film, the particular photographs from the hospital assignment that she was planning to include in the feature, and a separate series she had started after the assignment that she had not shown the magazine, that was just Amara, not the photographs Zoe had taken for work, but a separate body of work she had been doing on her own time, images taken on film with a deliberateness that was different from the documentary work, images that were about something specific. Amara looked at them for a long time. They were not the photographs of Dr. Osei that the magazine would use. They were photographs of the person underneath who existed in the margins of professional life in the moment before the professional self fully assembled in the hallway outside a difficult room, in the brief, unguarded second of genuine feeling, and they were the most honest record of herself Amara had ever seen. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "How do you do that?" And Zoe came to stand beside her, looking at the photographs too, and she said, "I just pay attention to you." And Amara said, "No one has ever paid that kind of attention to me." And Zoe turned to look at her and said, "I find that very hard to believe." And Amara said, "It is true." And something in the quality of the silence after that changed. Zoe reached out and touched her face very gently, just her fingertips at Amara's jaw, and Amara turned her head slightly into it, and they were standing very close. And Zoe said, "I've been wanting to do this for approximately 3 weeks." And Amara said, "Only 3 weeks?" And Zoe laughed, and then they were kissing. It was not the first kiss of people who are not sure yet. It was the first kiss of people who are completely sure, and who are kissing with the accumulated weight of weeks of wanting, which means it was not tentative at all. It was warm and certain and entirely present, and Amara had her hands in Zoe's ridiculous curls, which she had been thinking about without entirely acknowledging she was thinking about, and Zoe had one hand at her waist and one at her jaw, and they stood in the middle of the studio with the photographs surrounding them and kissed for a long time. When they eventually separated, Zoe was smiling in the way she smiled when something genuinely delighted her, which was with her whole face, and Amara was smiling too, and she thought, I'm not going to try to manage this feeling, I'm just going to feel it, Zoe said. So and Amara said so, and Zoe said, I have a working burner and ingredients for pasta, and Amara said that sounds like exactly what I want right now, and it was they cooked in the small kitchen alcove. Zoe on the working burner and Amara doing the preparation work because she was someone who had opinions about how garlic should be cut and who did it properly, and they talked while they cooked with the ease of people who had by now established that they were safe with each other, that honesty was welcome, and that silence was comfortable too. Zoe said at some point while she was stirring the sauce, I want to tell you something, and Amara said tell me, and Zoe said I've been in this city for 6 years and I've dated several people and I've had one serious relationship and I have made a lot of work and I've been mostly happy, but I've been waiting for something and I did not know what I was waiting for until you, and Amara was looking at her, and Zoe kept her eyes on the pan and said, I'm not trying to make this into something bigger than you want it to be. I just want you to know. Amara put down what she was doing and went to stand beside Zoe at the stove, and she said, I am not someone who says things I do not mean, and I'm not someone who acts without thinking about what I am doing, and I want you to know that when I am here it is because I want to be here completely. And Zoe finally looked at her and her eyes were bright, and she said, okay, and Amara said, okay. They ate at the work table because there was no proper table, pushing aside cameras and contact sheets, and Zoe lit a candle, which she said was entirely a practical decision about the lighting in the studio, and Amara said, of course, and they ate and talked, and the candle burned down gradually, and outside the city was doing its Saturday night things, and inside the studio, it was just the two of them. Amara stayed until midnight. When she left, Zoe walked her down to the street, and they stood on the sidewalk, and Amara said, I want you to come to dinner at my apartment next week, and Zoe said, yes, and Amara said, I'm going to cook properly, and Zoe said, I look forward to it very much. And Amara said, good, and then she kissed her again, and Zoe said, go home, and Amara said, I'm going, and she walked to her car and sat in it for a moment, feeling the specific warmth of someone new in your life, who is beginning to change the shape of things. Over the next month, they moved into the rhythm of each other. Amara cooked, and Zoe photographed things with her phone, this time just for herself, and Amara read while Zoe worked in the studio, and Zoe came to the Sunday dance class regularly, now sitting in her folding chair and watching with the expression she had on the first time, which was complete and unguarded attention. And sometimes they went dancing somewhere else on Saturday nights, to places where you could dance properly to music that moved through you, and Amara danced there too, but differently, more playfully, more with Zoe than within herself. And Zoe was a good dancer, not technically, but with that particular ease of someone who is comfortable in their body and comfortable being joyful in public. They spent weekends at each other's apartments, and Zoe's chaos began to exist in small deposits at Amara's place: a camera bag by the door, a jacket on the chair, a book left face down on the coffee table, and Amara's orderliness began to exist at Zoe's: a particular cup placed in a particular place, a certain quality of stillness in the middle of the studio. Chaos. Marcus noticed the change immediately. He said, you seem different. And Amara said, different how? And he said, lighter, and she said, I do not understand what that means. And he said, yes, you do. And she considered it and said, perhaps. And he said, the photographer, and she said, her name is Zoe. And he smiled very widely and said, I'm happy for you, genuinely, nurse. Delilah said nothing but started leaving 2 coffees at Amara's workstation every morning when she knew Amara had been on a late shift the previous night, which was a kindness that Amara recognized and accepted without comment, because that was the language between them. She told her mother about Zoe on a Sunday call in November, and her mother, who had been waiting for this kind of news with the patient certainty of someone who knew her daughter very well, said, tell me everything about her. And Amara, who was sitting in her favorite chair by the window with the morning light coming in, said, she's a photographer, and she is funny, and she's the most honest person I have met, and she pays attention in a way that used to make me want to be invisible and now makes me want to be seen completely. Her mother was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Amara, darling, and the way she said it contained 20 years of mothering and the specific joy of a parent who knows their child is finally choosing something right. On a Friday in December, there was an incident at the hospital that was serious. A multi-vehicle accident had brought in several patients simultaneously, and the emergency department was stretched thin, and Amara was called in on what was supposed to be her day off, and she was in the hospital for 14 hours. Zoe knew about it because Amara had texted her at noon to say, "I will not be able to make tonight, I'm sorry," and Zoe had texted back immediately, "Do not apologize, go save people, I will be here at 11 at night." When Amara finally got to her car, she found a paper bag on the passenger seat, which she had not locked because this was a hospital parking structure and Zoe had Amara's spare key for emergencies. In the bag was a container of the soup Amara liked from a place near Zoe's studio and a note that said, "This is not because I was worried, this is because you have been on your feet for 14 hours and you deserve soup, and also I lied. I was absolutely worried, but you were excellent, I know it." Amara sat in her car and ate the soup, which was still warm because Zoe had calculated the timing precisely, and she felt something in her chest that was too large for the car, and she called Zoe, who answered immediately, and Amara said, "Thank you," and Zoe said, "You ate it," and Amara said, "I'm eating it right now," and Zoe said, "Good, and how are you?" and Amara said, "Tired and a little wrung out and also very glad you exist," and Zoe said, "Well, I am very glad I exist too, particularly right now, and go home and sleep and call me tomorrow." Amara said goodnight, Zoe, and Zoe said goodnight, Amara, and there was a warmth in the word goodnight that neither of them had manufactured. It was just what it was. First time Amara told Zoe she loved her was not on a special occasion, it was not at dinner or at a moment manufactured for significance. It was on a Tuesday morning at 7:15 when Zoe had stayed the night and was standing in Amara's kitchen making coffee in the particular inefficient way she made it, which drove Amara slightly crazy because there was a correct way and Zoe had opinions about the correct way that were wrong, and they had this debate 4 times. Already Amara was sitting at her kitchen table in her running clothes because she'd been for a run and come back, and she was watching Zoe make coffee incorrectly, and Zoe was in one of Amara's shirts which was too long on her and had her hair in the kind of disorder that only happened when you had slept in a warm bed with someone you were easy with, and she was humming something under her breath and measuring coffee in a way that Amara was physically preventing herself from correcting, and Amara looked at her and thought with complete simplicity, "I love her," and then she said it out loud because she was someone who said what she meant. She said Zoe, and Zoe turned with a coffee spoon in her hand and said, "Yes," and Amara said, "I love you." Zoe looked at her, she did not move for a moment, then she put the spoon down very carefully on the counter and crossed the kitchen, and she cupped Amara's face in both her hands, and she said, "Amara Osei, I have loved you since the 2nd week in that hospital when you came out of that consultation room and did not pretend to be fine, and I was so afraid you were going to be too careful to let me tell you." Amara said, "I am not being too careful," and Zoe said, "No, you are not," and she kissed her, and the coffee was eventually made incorrectly, and Amara did not correct it because some things matter more than the correct way to make coffee. It is now February, and Dr. Amara Osei still walks through the hospital corridors the way she always has, with the kind of presence that makes the air feel steadier, and she is still the person the residents model themselves on, and the person the nurses trust, and the person the patients reach for in moments of fear. She is still all of that, but the staff who pay attention, which at this point is most of them, have noticed small things, the way she is sometimes smiling at her phone between patients with an expression that is private and warm. Photograph on her desk that was not there before, a black and white photograph of the river path in the early morning fog, taken from behind a figure who is running, and who is clearly Amara, and taken by someone who knows exactly how to find the truth in a single frame. The way Marcus smiles when anyone mentions the photographer, the way Delilah leaves 2 coffees, the way Amara herself moves through the day with all of her usual precision and all of her usual care, but with something additional that is not quite visible, but that is felt the way warmth is felt coming from inside a building when you walk past it on a cold night after the last patient on a Friday evening. She gets in her car and she goes to Zoe's studio, or Zoe comes to her apartment, and sometimes they cook, and sometimes they dance, and sometimes they walk the city streets at night, and sometimes they sit in companionable quiet reading their own books, and sometimes they go out with friends who are becoming their friends together, and sometimes Zoe is working on something and Amara reads or writes in one of her notebooks that she does not show anyone, except now sometimes she shows Zoe, and sometimes they dance properly, just the 2 of them in the apartment with the music turned up in the way you can turn music up when you are not performing for anyone, with no performance at all, just movement and closeness and the specific joy of 2 people who have found the frequency where they match at the hospital. Dr. Osei is precisely what she has always been. It is only after office hours, only with Zoe, only in the life that belongs entirely to herself, that you would see the full thing, and it is not a different person, it is more of the same person, it is all the parts together, and together they are. Extraordinary Zoe knows this. She has the photographs to prove it. She keeps them in a folder on her hard drive labeled simply, which Amara found one day by accident and pretended not to see, and then went very still and looked at them for a long time and then closed the laptop gently and said nothing, except later that night she took Zoe's face in her hands and held it for a long moment, saying nothing, which was more than enough. This is what they are, two people who saw each other, who kept looking, who chose each other with their eyes open, who are building something together that has roots in honesty and warmth and the willingness to be known completely. The hospital sees the doctor, but she knows the restand, the rest is the best part.